The air in the room was thick with tension, and the weight of it was palpable. Harlem's streets had always been a place where men made their living, carved their legacies, and left their marks. But this was a different kind of moment. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, had faced rivals before, but this time it was personal. The tension was never higher than when the men of Lucky Luciano's crew stood in front of him, guns drawn, intent on sending a message. "You think you can just come into my town and push me around?" Bumpy's voice cut through the silence, steady and calm despite the guns pointed directly at him. His stance was relaxed, his hands behind his back, but those who knew him could feel the simmering storm just beneath the surface. He wasn't scared. Not of these men, not of anyone. The thugs, all trained by the infamous Luciano crew, had their orders. Make Bumpy submit, show him who was truly in charge. But there was one problem. They were facing the wrong man, the wrong legend. Bumpy's reputation was more than just street talk. He commanded authority by action, not just words. The moment was so intense that it almost felt frozen in time. The weight of the confrontation was felt across every inch of the room. Harlem had its kings, its rulers, and its giants. And right here, right now, Bumpy Johnson stood tall, a mountain that none of Luciano's men would ever move. But it wasn't just about the guns. It was the sheer defiance. The silence stretched on until Bumpy finally spoke again. "Go ahead, take your best shot. See what happens next." No one moved. The tension in the air became unbearable, like a whip ready to crack, but no one dared to strike first. It wasn't a fight of fists or bullets. It was a battle of wills, a battle for respect, and the man standing before them had earned it. In that split second, Lucky Luciano's men realized something that they hadn't fully understood before. They weren't dealing with just any gangster. Bumpy Johnson was a force of nature, unyielding, unbroken, a man who had survived everything the streets could throw at him. And now it was his turn to make them feel the weight of their own mistakes. Bumpy Johnson didn't come from the world of privilege. Harlem's streets had shaped him, refined him into something more than a mere man. They had transformed him into a symbol of power, respect, and most importantly, survival. Harlem wasn't a place where mercy was shown. Every corner held stories of those who had risen to power and those who had fallen, swallowed up by the very streets they once ruled. Bumpy's rise had been a mix of savvy, grit, and relentless determination. He didn't fear the streets, he ruled them. The 1940s in Harlem was a time of profound transformation. With Prohibition ending, a new era of power struggles began. Organized crime was evolving, and men like Lucky Luciano were making their mark. Luciano had quickly become one of the most powerful men in the world, controlling not just the streets, but the very underworld itself. His reach extended far beyond the confines of New York, and his name alone struck fear into the hearts of men who dared challenge him. But Harlem was a different world, a world where Bumpy Johnson had already earned his crown. He had been under the mentorship of the infamous Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson before him, and now, as the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld, he made his own rules. He controlled the numbers, the rackets, and the movement of illegal goods in and out of the neighborhood. His power was absolute within his domain. But as always with power, enemies loomed from the shadows. The tension between Johnson and Luciano's organization was inevitable. Harlem was a lucrative spot, one that Luciano wanted a stronger foothold in. But Bumpy wasn't some low-tier gangster that could be easily intimidated or pushed out. He had built his empire brick by brick, making strategic alliances and, most importantly, making sure that anyone who crossed him would regret it. He'd taken down bigger threats, survived assassination attempts, and navigated the world of law enforcement, rival gangs, and crooked politicians. All with one goal in mind: control. It wasn't just business, it was personal. He wasn't going to let some out-of-town gangsters walk into his turf and tell him how to run things. That's when Luciano's crew, led by his most trusted men, decided they would take matters into their own hands. It was a move that would prove fatal. They thought that, with the threat of guns, they could force Bumpy into submission. But Bumpy wasn't one to bow down to threats. He'd survived too many moments like this, and he knew how to turn the tables in the blink of an eye. His reputation was built on respect, not fear. And as those men aimed their weapons at him, Bumpy felt no fear. Instead, he felt something stronger. The weight of his own authority, something that no bullet could erase. The air was thick with tension. In a dimly lit room in the heart of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson stood at the center, facing the men of Lucky Luciano. Their hands rested on the grips of their guns, the cold metal reflecting the harsh light overhead. They were a force to be reckoned with, a well-oiled machine of criminals who had terrorized New York for years. But they weren't in New York now. They were in Harlem, Bumpy's turf. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. But they had guns, and they thought that gave them leverage. "Let's keep this simple, Bumpy," one of the men said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "You've been holding down this piece of real estate for too long. It's time for a new order. You either take the deal, or we take over." The threat was clear, but Bumpy stood tall, unflinching, his eyes steady, unwavering. He wasn't the kind of man to bow to intimidation, especially from men who didn't understand Harlem's heartbeat. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He looked at each of them, one by one, as if sizing them up. He knew that they weren't just here to negotiate. They were here to take what they thought was rightfully theirs. But that wasn't how the streets worked. It wasn't how Bumpy worked. "You think this?" The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as the men stood frozen in the face of Bumpy's challenge. The tension between them was so palpable, it felt like a live wire, charged and dangerous. The heavy weight of the guns in their hands did nothing to ease the unease spreading through the room. Bumpy's voice cut through the silence again, like a blade slicing the tension. "I'm not asking, gentlemen. I'm telling you. You don't get to walk in here, guns drawn, and try to take what I've built. Not without consequences." The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, took a step forward. His hand tightened around the grip of his gun. His men mirrored his motion, their fingers itching for the trigger. They had come prepared to fight, prepared to end this once and for all. But they weren't expecting Bumpy to stand his ground, to make them feel the weight of his presence, the force of his resolve. "You're just a street thug, Johnson," the man spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're untouchable? You think these people, these streets, will protect you?" Bumpy's expression didn't change. His eyes stayed fixed on the man, unflinching. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about power. It's about respect. You don't get to come into my neighborhood and make demands, not without paying the price." The man scoffed, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "And what's the price, huh? What do you think you can do against us? You think these streets can shield you forever?" At that, Bumpy's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. There was a coldness in his eyes now, a sharpness that sent a chill through the room. He wasn't bluffing, and they all knew it. He stepped forward, his boots hitting the floor with deliberate force, each step a challenge in itself. "You're not dealing with some boy who's just gonna back down, not when you point a gun at him," Bumpy said, his voice low but brimming with authority. "But if you want a fight, I'll give you one." A cold silence descended again. The mobsters, who thought they had the upper hand, now found themselves questioning their own confidence. Guns or not, there was something about Bumpy's presence, his demeanor, that made them hesitate. They weren't dealing with an ordinary man, not a mere criminal. They were facing a legend, someone whose reputation alone was enough to strike fear into even the most hardened criminals. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The leader made his move, lifting his gun, and the others followed suit. Their weapons now fully aimed at Bumpy. They were determined to finish this, one way or another. But in the blink of an eye, Bumpy reacted. With lightning speed, he reached into his coat and pulled out the infamous razor, a tool that had become his signature weapon. It wasn't just a blade. It was an extension of his will, a symbol of his authority, and a reminder that Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone to be crossed. The mobsters froze. Their eyes widened as the razor gleamed in Bumpy's hand, its edge catching the light. For a split second, there was confusion, hesitation, a moment where they all wondered if they'd underestimated him. "You really want to do this?" Bumpy asked, his voice barely a whisper, but the menace behind it was clear. He wasn't just talking to the man in front of him. He was speaking to all of them. No one moved. No one fired. The guns remained pointed, but the tension in the room had shifted. Bumpy had done something none of them had expected. He had taken the fear out of the situation and placed it squarely on their shoulders. For a moment, the room was locked in time, the silence deafening. Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't back down. His eyes stayed locked on the leaders, and with the slightest movement of his hand, he twirled the razor, a subtle but calculated show of skill and control. "You're not getting out of here alive if you make the wrong move," Bumpy continued, his voice steady but commanding. "The streets are mine, and that's not changing, so you have a choice. Walk out with your lives or leave in pieces. The choice is yours." The leader's grip on his gun wavered for just a second, but it was enough. That one moment of doubt was all Bumpy needed. The razor in his hand wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol, and in that moment, it spoke louder than any gun could. The tension finally broke, but not in the way the mobsters expected. Slowly, the leader lowered his weapon, followed by the others. They hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated Bumpy's unyielding resolve. And in that moment, they realized they couldn't win this fight. Not with force, not with guns, not with intimidation. Bumpy had shown them that respect, power, and courage could do what no weapon ever could. The room remained still, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. No one dared to move. No one dared to challenge the man standing before them, holding his ground, razor still gleaming in his hand. For what felt like an eternity, the room was frozen in a charged silence. Bumpy Johnson stood tall, unwavering, as the mobsters stood before him, weapons lowered, but tension still thick in the air. Their guns, once aimed with deadly intent, were now mere extensions of their uncertainty. Bumpy's razor gleamed in the dim light like a beacon of defiance, its very presence radiating the power he held over the moment. It was a standoff like no other, not with bullets, but with willpower, respect, and the weight of years of struggle and survival. The men of Lucky Luciano's crew, who had come with the firm belief that they would intimidate Bumpy into submission, were now faced with the truth. They had underestimated him. The leader, who had been the first to aim his gun, was the first to drop his eyes. His body language shifted subtly, betraying the discomfort now gnawing at him. The cocky, arrogant swagger that had defined him moments ago vanished, replaced by hesitation. "I told you," Bumpy spoke quietly, his voice low and controlled. "You don't come into my house and think you can walk all over me. I built this, and I'll defend it with everything I have." For a long moment, the mobsters simply stood there, unsure of how to react. The situation had shifted so quickly that their minds were struggling to keep up. Bumpy was a legend in Harlem, the embodiment of power and respect. What had started as a confrontation with armed men now felt more like a ritualized display of dominance. It was clear that they weren't dealing with just any street boss. They were up against a man who had already survived too much to be cowed by threats. The leader of the group exhaled sharply, his posture slumping just a fraction. "We didn't come here to start a war, Johnson," he muttered, his voice tense. "We were just..." "Just what?" Bumpy cut him off. "You think you can walk in here and offer me a deal? You think I'll bend over backward for you? This is my turf, and you either show me respect or you leave. No middle ground, no negotiation." The mobster swallowed hard, then glanced at his men. They were all looking at him now, waiting for a signal, for the next move. The mob's reputation in the streets wasn't based on mercy. They were supposed to be the ones in control, the ones who dictated terms. But now, for the first time, they were forced to face the truth. In Harlem, it wasn't the name that commanded respect. It was the man who could back it up, and Bumpy had just proven that in spades. The leader stepped back, his gun still loosely in his hand, but the bravado gone from his stance. He knew he had lost. "I'll make sure the word gets out," he said reluctantly, eyes never fully meeting Bumpy's. This won't happen again." Bumpy's gaze was unwavering. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words. "It better not," he said simply. With that, the mobsters slowly started to retreat. Their guns were lowered, but there was a reluctance in their movements, a hesitation that wasn't there when they first entered the room. As they backed toward the door, Bumpy didn't move. He didn't need to. He was in control, and they knew it. When the last of them had finally exited, the door closing softly behind them, the room was still. The tension, though gone, left its mark. The air was heavy with the aftermath of a battle not fought with fists or bullets, but with sheer, unflinching will. Bumpy stood there for a moment longer, his eyes locked on the door, the silence ringing in his ears. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He had made his point. He had shown Lucky Luciano's men and everyone else watching that Bumpy Johnson wasn't to be disrespected, not in his streets, not in his world. Slowly, he placed the razor back into his coat pocket. His hands didn't tremble. His mind was calm. This was just another victory in a long line of them, each one carving out his legend, each one cementing his place at the top. But as the events of that day played out in his mind, Bumpy couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The streets of Harlem, his Harlem, would never be the same. Not after this. And neither would the mobsters who thought they could just waltz in and take control. The days that followed the confrontation were quiet, but there was an undercurrent of tension in Harlem. Word spread fast, as it always did. By the time the sun had set that evening, everyone knew what had happened at that meeting, and everyone knew who came out on top. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had once been a shadow in the streets, had just proven to the most powerful criminals in the world that Harlem was his. The reputation he had spent years building, one move at a time, one calculated risk after another, had now reached its peak. No one doubted it anymore. Not the hustlers on the corner, not the business owners, and certainly not the men of Lucky Luciano's crew. But more than his reputation, it was his aura of invincibility that was solidified. Harlem was a tough place, but Bumpy Johnson was tougher. He had survived wars with the police, skirmishes with rival gangs, and the constant threat of being undercut by men who thought they could run his turf better than he could. Yet, in all that time, he had never backed down, not once. And now, with the way he handled the mobsters, his legend had grown even more. He wasn't just the king of Harlem. He was a force of nature, a man who would not be intimidated by anyone, not even the most powerful crime syndicate in the world. In the weeks that followed, there were no more visits from Lucky Luciano's men. They knew better now. Harlem was off limits, and anyone who even thought about challenging Bumpy's territory knew the cost. But the consequences of that day reached beyond the streets of Harlem. Bumpy's rise to power was not just a story of survival, but of strategic dominance. His actions against Luciano's men had sent a shockwave through the criminal underworld. To the men who lived by violence and intimidation, Bumpy Johnson had just set the ultimate example. True power wasn't about the number of men behind you or the size of your empire. It was about the respect you commanded and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. For Bumpy, there was no celebration, no moment of grand triumph. He didn't need one. The respect he had earned that day was enough. It was in the way people treated him from that point forward, a mixture of wariness and reverence. The kind of respect that comes only when one man proves he is unbreakable, even when the odds are stacked against him. In his quiet moments, Bumpy knew that this was his legacy. He had carved out a place for himself in the history of Harlem. But more importantly, he had shown that power could be wielded with purpose. It wasn't about violence for the sake of it, nor was it about proving something to anyone. It was about respect, loyalty, and taking ownership of the streets that had shaped him. Over time, Bumpy's name became synonymous with control. His rule was unchallenged, not because he was feared, though many feared him, but because people respected him. They knew what he had done. They knew the way he handled business. And in a world where loyalty was often bought and sold, Bumpy Johnson had built something that could not be bought: unwavering authority. Harlem, and the streets that Bumpy had claimed as his own, became a different place in the years that followed. The battles that had once raged between criminals, gangs, and authorities began to calm. The streets had a new rhythm, one governed by the unspoken rules Bumpy had laid down. Respect the man, and the man would respect you. Cross him, and the consequences would be swift, but never without reason. The legend of Bumpy Johnson wasn't just built on the force of his hand, but on the mind behind the action. The mob might have been the power on the outside, but Bumpy Johnson's influence was the power at the heart of Harlem. It was the street-level wisdom that ruled in ways the mafia never fully understood. As time went on, Bumpy's name would continue to echo through the streets of Harlem. He became the stuff of legend, not only because of his ruthlessness, but because of his undeniable presence. The man who took on the biggest crime syndicate in the world and came out on top. The man who, when facing down armed mobsters, could make them back down with nothing more than his unshakable gaze and the sheer force of his will. To this day, the name Bumpy Johnson is spoken with a mix of awe and respect. He was more than just a gangster. He was a symbol of the power that comes from standing firm, from never flinching, and from knowing when to strike. As the years passed, the streets of Harlem changed, but the story of Bumpy Johnson's legendary confrontation with Lucky Luciano's men remained one of the defining moments in the city's history. Harlem was a place built on power, not just brute strength, but the kind of power that came from the streets themselves. Bumpy's legend was one of wisdom, courage, and above all, respect. In the criminal underworld, there's often a mythic quality to the legends that survive the test of time. But in Bumpy's case, it was not just a tale of bravado. It was the story of a man who understood the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, the power of knowing when to act and when to wait, and the importance of commanding respect, not just demanding it. When he faced off with Luciano's men, it wasn't just about protecting his turf. It was about standing firm in the face of intimidation, about sending a message that no one, not even the most powerful mobsters, could cross him without facing the consequences. That moment in time, when the men with guns aimed at Bumpy Johnson, showed the world that there were lines you didn't cross in Harlem. And Bumpy, with nothing but his will and resolve, showed that he wasn't afraid to make those lines clear. His legacy was built not just on his actions, but on the way he carried himself through them. He never needed to boast or flaunt his power. The respect that followed him was earned by the sheer force of his presence. He taught everyone around him that true power isn't about how loudly you shout, but about the silence in the room when you step in. For Bumpy Johnson, this was never about fear. It was about earning the unshakable respect of those who dared to challenge him, proving that real power is silent but undeniable. It's the kind of power that resonates long after the smoke is cleared and long after the guns are lowered. This wasn't just about one man's fight. This was about an entire community's sense of pride, dignity, and respect. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world that some lines can never be crossed.